So, this first session today is all about the shadowy border zones between obviously problematic or harmful content and behaviour on online platforms and benign or positive or progressive behaviour. It's in this grey zone that most of the energy, innovation, policy making is going right now in terms of the platformed media environment. I'm delighted to have 4 fantastic experts from the ADM+S community to speak with you. This morning I'm going to briefly read each of their bios and then we're going to go in alphabetical order. So this is the order in which people will speak. So first of all, we're really grateful to have Robyn Kaplan recently awarded her PhD with us. Robyn's affiliated with one of the Centre's part organisations, the Data and Society Research Institute. Robyn conducts research at the intersection of platform governance and media policy. Her work takes an organisational approach towards understanding the development of content standards by platforms, looking specifically at the role platforms are playing in mediating between different stakeholder groups in the creation and enforcement of content policies. And her most recent work is examining the role verification will play in the future of platform governance. So some links with many of the topics about news and media we were discussing yesterday. Next speaker is QUT's Dr. Timothy Graham. Tim's a senior lecturer in digital media here at QUT in the Digital Media Research Centre and an associate investigator in ADM+S. His research combines computational methods with social theory to study online networks and platforms with a particular interest in online bots and trolls, disinformation and online ratings and rankings devices. He develops open software tools for big data analysis and is published in journals such as Information, Communication and Society, Information Polity, Big Data and Society, and Critical Social Policy. He's going to talk to us about bots. Ariadna Matamoros-Fernandez is a lecturer in digital media also at QUT, and is associate investigator in ADM+S and a chief investigator at the DMRC. Her research focuses on the interplay between user practices and platform politics in co-shaping contemporary racism. She's setting up a research agenda around platform governance in relation to memes and other controversial humorous content, and has extensive experience in building digital methods to study digital platforms. Ari's going to talk to us about the problems of identifying and dealing with harmful humour, I think. And our 4th speaker, Russell Skelton, also on Zoom, coming to us from Melbourne, is the director of another one of our collaborators in the ADM+S Centre, the RMIT ABC Fact Check, and its research partner, RMIT Fact Lab. He was the founding editor of ABC Fact Check, which is, and ABC, of course, is one of ADM+S's partners, including through that work. Russell's held senior editorial positions at Fairfax, the ABC, and News Limited. So looking forward to hearing all of the issue of an emergence of content moderation. I think my mic's a bit dodgy, isn't it? I'm going to hand over to Robyn. Welcome, Robyn. Let's give her a hand for joining us from the evening in New York, I think.
Thank you. I was worried your mic was my internet coming in and out, so I'm very glad to hear that is not the case. But sorry about your microphone. I want to thank everybody for having me here, in particular Jean and Axel. I'm a huge fan of the work of everyone at ADM+S. So it's very exciting to get to join from abroad. I am currently sitting in Brooklyn, New York. It is Thursday night where I am, and I feel the need to warn everybody that pretty soon my toddler is going to be coming in through the front door, and he might barge in at any time. So we will hopefully that won't happen. He will be distracted by The Wiggles, which is the only show he will watch. So we have the Australian spirit in our whole house right now. Jean said to keep our remarks short, and I'm going to do my best. I've done a couple of papers on this topic, looking at how organizational dynamics at platforms contribute to how they address borderline content. One paper I did, which I published back in 2018, called Content or Context Moderation, was a comparative approach of all of the major platforms, and looked at how the size of the company, whether they use kind of industrial, more smaller scale approaches or community reliant approaches, impacted how they balance this tension between their need to operate at scale and their need to address the needs of their various subcommunities and the cultural context in which they were operating. But I'm not going to talk about that paper today. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. I'm not talking about it mostly because it's pretty old. So it might be relevant here. For this panel, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this topic and summarize some work I did with Tarleton Gillespie on one strategy platforms are using to determine how they distribute resources in content moderation, which certainly applies when we're talking about borderline content, and the role that plays in who, when, and what gets moderated, and by what means, so manual, automated, and semi-automated tools. So this work doesn't necessarily address borderline content head on in the way that I think many of my fellow panelists will, but it does highlight how decisions about what gets moderated and what doesn't are made and how they can privilege certain players on platforms. With this, I want to highlight the ways in which who is doing the speaking can complicate discussions about borderline content and moderation. So a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published an investigation by the journalist Jeff Horowitz into Facebook's cross-check program. This program reportedly allowed nearly any Facebook employee at their own discretion to whitelist users who were newsworthy, influential, or popular, or PR risky. The result of this program, as his reporting showed, was that 5.8 million users were moderated according to different rules than ordinary Facebook users, or hardly moderated at all. This led to a system of elite, invisible tiers at Facebook, which meant that the speech of the powerful and influential actors was protected, while ordinary people's speech was moderated by automated algorithms and by overworked humans. So Facebook has said in the past its rules apply to all, but these documents proved differently. And we all knew that. We could see it. We could see it all the time. So it was always kind of laughable that they said this. In June 2020, when Trump wrote in a post, when the shooting starts, the looting starts, an overtly, historically racist phrase, especially within the United States, there was widespread outrage and confusion about how Facebook could allow such clearly violating content to remain on its platform. This investigation showed that the content was indeed flagged as 90 out of 100, indicating a high likelihood the content violated the platform's rules. This would have led to a clear removal for an ordinary user, but for Trump and for a lot of other public officials and celebrities, the rules were different. So as Tarleton's and my research shows, this is actually not uncommon at platforms. Other platforms besides Facebook are enforcing different standards for different users as part of their business model. So in our article, which we published last year in Social Media and Society, called Tiered Governance and Demonetization, the Shifting Terms of Labor and Compensation in the Platform Economy, we explained how YouTube takes what we call the tiered governance approach, separating users into categories and applying different rules for each category's videos. We explored this issue in relation to demonetization. So that's basically how they determine whether or not ad revenue should be taken away from somebody who's in the partner program who gets a share of the ad revenue. What we found was that Facebook has lots of different user groups that they use to distinguish when and how rules apply, and that includes kind of established media, these creators in the partner program, and there's kind of more subtle tiers within that, and then other users. For Facebook, it appeared their program developed as a stopgap measure to avoid public relations issues that might happen if the company deleted content from powerful figures. For YouTube, it began when it created a special category of paid users, the YouTube Partner Program, to give popular YouTubers incentives to stay on the site and make more content. YouTube then made more intricate tiers. Established media who had more direct financial relationships with the company were allowed to sell their own ads and therefore removed from the need to conform to advertiser-friendly guidelines. Influential members of those in YouTube's own creator economy were also given special privileges, which led them to develop a closer relationship with YouTube employees, which could help them deal with demonetization and content moderation issues quickly. What this meant was that, like Facebook, YouTube differentiated in how they applied their guidelines. Though for the majority of users, algorithms were being used to determine whether a video posted to the platform violated these rules. Those who were whitelisted and those with strong ties to the company could find workarounds much faster, and that had real social, financial, and reputational impact. Constantly unfolding concerns from another important stakeholder group here, advertisers, also impacted who got caught up in the system and who didn't. So over 2016 to 2018, we counted 8 distinct periods of demonetization where how advertiser-friendly guidelines were enforced. It's happening, guys, sorry. And for whom changed. I'm so sorry. I knew this was going to happen. I warned everybody. One moment. Okay.
I might just take the opportunity, Robyn, to remind everyone that they should be putting their questions and comments into the Slido app, slido.com event number 101. Anyway, are you right?
Okay. I'm just going to unwrap it.
We don't mind a little bit of toddler action, I have to say.
I mean, this is intense chaos toddler action. This is coming home looking for mom toddler action. So I'm going to just summarize quickly. Creators were frustrated. They didn't object to different rules and perks for different user groups, kind of surprisingly. But they didn't like the unpredictability of YouTube's decisions. And they constantly pointed to examples that highlighted the unfairness of how rules were applied and to whom. So Jimmy Kimmel was often brought up as like the main example of this. His videos on certain topics were untouched, whereas other creators had their content demonetized. So what our research shows is that no matter what the reasons are, so there's lots of reasons that you can think of to tier different user groups and to treat them differently. COVID is a great example. People really kind of demanded that platforms take a different approach to that kind of content and prioritize information from official sources. But what our research shows is that no matter what the reasons are, any sort of setup that is not transparent and can lead to unequal treatment can breed suspicion and distrust. In particular with borderline content, what I think this shows is that platforms are already making decisions that benefit certain values in trying to distinguish between different types of content and users. And they could be doing this to benefit different groups. I'm just going to stop there and hand it off to my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, everyone. Let's thank Robyn. Okay, Tim, let's hear about bots.
Okay, thanks, Robyn. I'm amazed that I'm actually made it this morning. I have a former toddler who's now 4, and I had to get him ready and get in the car, and he woke up at 8 o'clock. So it's really great to be here and to be able to actually physically add something to this conversation. What I'd like to talk about really briefly is the issue of social bots. And I think that when it comes to problematic content and automation, this phenomenon has gained a lot of attention over the past half a decade. The issue of accounts on social media that are automated or mostly automated, like controlled by a computer, controlled by a script, and what kind of effect are these kinds of actors within our information ecologies having, and how prevalent are they? And what I'd like to propose here, rather, it's not really controversially, I don't think, but what I want to put on the table, following on from what Robyn mentioned and from what was discussed yesterday, was a question around to what extent, and I say this very, very carefully, to what extent do social bots exist? Something that we've found in the research that we've been doing over the last half a decade, but even over the last couple of years, is how difficult it is to find accounts on any platform, whether it be Reddit, whether it be Twitter, accounts like that, that actually fit the archetype of a persona, like a profile that's controlled completely by a machine. This popular imaginary of the social bot. You go online and you see something that catches your attention, but it was, I'm just going to say it was a Russian bot or something like that, something that really factors into the popular imagination. And I think what really through my conceptual understanding of this and my empirical approach to analyzing social bots was I think a really instructive and kind of funny, but also problematic case study. So on Reddit, it's a little bit early in the morning to be talking about this, but I just want to put it out there because I need to talk about it. We're embarking on a project soon, and I've done a little bit of case study analysis of a major problem that Reddit had for a while. And the problem was this. There were these accounts. It began with one account, and the account was called Anus Fungi. Anus Fungi. With a whole bunch of letters and strings and underscores in the name. When Anus Fungi started to post, all Anus Fungi did was to post a single mushroom emoji randomly into threads on Reddit. And Reddit's a very thread kind of, right? Everything is about these discussions that are ranked. And at first, from what I could see, based on the small amount of analysis that I'm doing with colleagues here in the ADM+S on this project, at first that people found it funny. It was hilarious. They're like, oh, we've been blessed by Anus Fungi. Anus Fungi came to our thread and spammed a few mushroom emojis. And this is great. And they upvoted it a lot, right? So Anus Fungi actually ended up at the top. These mushroom spamming accounts ended up at the top of the threads. But things soon took a turn for the worse. Fast forward to about 6 months later, and you had entire subreddits, forums on Reddit that were dedicated to eradicating the Anus Fungi problem on Reddit. The mushrooms were out of control. And although it may be somewhat entertaining, it was a serious moderation issue. And this, what began as a kind of fun, I guess, culturally infused with the kinds of cultural vernaculars that Reddit has, soon turned into something that was really problematic. So you had thousands and thousands of copycat Anus Fungi accounts, all with Anus Fungi in the name, but some string of like characters and underscores in there. And they were posting emojis in places where people were talking about serious issues. I mean, they were talking, about depression. They were subreddits that were about mental health issues, subreddits like teenagers, for example, where people come and are looking for mentors and things like this. Places on Reddit that do have that are not appropriate, I think, in a normative kind of way for this kind of fun troll-like behavior. And I'm not sure. I've kind of lost track of time. This is what this case study does to a person. So what are we gonna do about it? So the real takeaway for this phenomenon for me, and I think this is why I'm so interested to study this and to work on it with the diverse cast of scholars who can provide different perspectives. It really is to look at, well, to what extent do people behave like bots, and in what circumstances is that okay? In what circumstances do we encourage that, and how do we go about trying to together come to a sort of almost a whole of society response to moderating and making sense of this content? This microphone keeps breaking. And just to pick up really briefly, I guess, on some of the other points, I do this is there are platform specifics to this. Reddit is one particular platform, but I see so many instances of this, and the frustrations that I have trying to determine whether an account is a bot or not. I really think that this is a poor way to frame this problem. Using machine learning tools and things like that is a poor sort of impoverished approach to trying to understand this. So really what I wanted to do was spend this time to raise to your attention just the kind of difficulties, the conceptual slipperiness that we have trying to understand to what extent something is problematic or whether it's something that is fun and makes life worth living, as Jean mentioned yesterday. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so what is it that we worry about when we worry about bots? Might be the sort of deep question, yeah. Right, so from that little bit of comedy over to a more serious discussion of humour and how it can be problematic. Ari.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to intervene now after Anus fungi like discussion, but I'll try my best. Yeah, I have something to say about emoji too. So yeah, I've been looking at borderline content, that it's like this content that it comes close but does not violate like platforms policies for a few years now. And currently I'm looking at humorous expression on social media and how platforms fail to differentiate between humor that punches up as socially beneficial and humor that punches down as socially harmful. And I'm looking into this problem, if you will, especially in the context of the online harms regulation and how different governments are pushing sorry, legislation to really push platforms to tackle the issue of how harm is carried out through their networks. Sorry. And the way that I'm looking into this is by proposing the term of harmful humor. And I define harmful humor as humor that punches down on historically marginalized groups and where there's a clear power imbalance between who is the speaker and who's the target of the joke. And I think that this is important, and based on what Robyn was saying about that Facebook really looks into the power of the speaker when they are moderating content. But I'm looking into power not that much into like how authoritative someone is based on because they are a public figure or like a politician, but power in terms of what Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of privilege and oppression. So how our social positions, how our positionality really impacts meaning and truth, especially when we are engaging in humorous expression online. So if I'm talking from a race privilege and I'm engaging in a racist joke, this is problematic. And it's not merely offensive, but it's harmful. And it requires platforms to really intervene. And one of the problems is how platforms conceptualize what is harmful. And that's why we have to use alternative frameworks to really first define properly, starting off from the experiences of those that are often targeted by online abuse, including harmful humor, and then thinking about different remedies that we could apply to really minimize the harm. That it doesn't have to be just takedowns or account suspension. There are other remedies that platforms could implement to really minimize the harms. And one example, sorry, I don't know what's going on. So what Tim was saying about emoji, we have a recent example of black soccer players in the UK that were abused by fans that they were sending them like monkey emojis and emojis of bananas. And platforms really, because they don't think about how online abuse is being mediated through this kind of humorous expression and playful behavior, they didn't have in place mechanisms to really minimize this kind of abuse that the footballers were saying that this was racist abuse. I've done some research around also how right-wing political parties also use emojis for Islamophobic discourse, like weaponizing, for instance, the pig emoji to antagonize the Muslim community. So I think it's important that we think about how to really moderate this borderline content. There's another point that I would like to raise that maybe we can discuss, that in this interest in regulate like online harms, there's the emergence of middleware companies. So if I could have a bit of water. Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry. Thank you. So yeah, there's these middleware companies that like Centropy or Two Hats. Discord recently bought Centropy, and these companies are offering kind of, okay, platforms really are not good into moderating borderline content and online abuse, but we are going to solve this problem. And I think that from a standpoint perspective, it's really interesting to look at these companies to see really whether they are approaching the issue of online abuse, of what is harmful, from other, like using other frameworks, or if they are going to reproduce all the mistakes that mainstream platforms are already doing when they are tackling on online abuse. So I think that this is an area that requires further investigation. These platforms that are really lobbying regulators to just say, okay, you know what, it's better that platforms hire these third-party companies to solve the issue. And the last point that I would like to raise is that maybe we could also discuss in this panel not only borderline content, but borderline conduct. And this is related to the inauthentic behavior that you are looking at and the bots. And recently in a study that I did with Luisa Bartolo here, we looked at Twitter discussions around COVID and how Twitter users were sharing YouTube URLs in a suspicious way. So these were Twitter users that were sharing URLs maybe 50 times, 100 times, 200 times. And when we did the qualitative analysis, what we realized at the account level that they were behaving in this kind of bot-like behavior, that around 35% of these users were not engaging in this bot-like behavior to mislead, but they were YouTube content creators trying to professionalize on YouTube and really trying to promote their content in an increasingly platform media system that it's really difficult to get seen. And the problem is that we don't know how platforms really regulate inauthentic behavior. We don't know the thresholds. And because we don't know how they operationalize their policies around inauthentic or borderline behavior, we can really analyze whether they are harming also emerging content creators, that the only thing that they are using is using the infrastructure of these platforms to really be seen and amass an audience. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ari. So now back to Zoom and over to you, Russell. Welcome. I think you're on mute.
I'll try again.
There we go. Yep.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. It's a great privilege to be here, part of this panel. I come from a slightly different perspective, of course. Our background, we started out as traditional fact checkers, checking statements made on the public record by public figures to test their accuracy in terms of the public policy debate. But when we got to the sort of 2018 election, we discovered that we were late to the party, that a lot of the serious debates that were taking place around policy or around the misinformation, disinformation space were taking place on Facebook. So we were focusing entirely on the public record, and we were missing what I think was probably a crucial part of the election outcome, which was what was appearing on Facebook and Instagram and other platforms, and how that was, the Conservatives had a team and a network of people all working to push out the disinformation. As we know, that election was won in Queensland with, and it was a very close one. So we thought this is a very important area which we're missing in action on, in a way. And also our remit with the ABC prevented us from actually getting into that space in a major way. And then we had the season of wildfires, which swept through the east coast of Australia and parts of Western Australia. And we saw the, it's arsonists, not climate change debate, and all that false and misleading information that was pushed out around that. We responded to that a bit by doing sort of fact files and analysis pieces of that, but in a fairly sort of superficial way. And then, of course, we arrived at COVID, and the conclusion I reached was the traditional fact checking is not very effective in this space. It is in terms of our policymakers, but it's not very effective in terms of addressing the impact of harmful information circulating on social media platforms. So we've come up with the concept of RMIT Fact Lab, which means that we don't have to operate within the ABC remit. We can expand it into this new space, and we just launched it actually. And the big challenge we have before us, of course, is the coming election. So we want to be an effective player in that space and try and track some of the misinformation and disinformation and call it out when we see it. And so FactLab is sort of very different to RMIT ABC Fact Check in the sense that we're involved in debunking posts on social media. We want to get into the research space very much. We're also already embarked on the teaching and learning space. So we're out there teaching journalists and media managers in the Pacific at the moment how to go about fact checking and how about how they go about debunking misinformation. And that project is just unfolding now. And we've had other offers of people wanting to transpose our methodology of fact checking into this space. And the other thing we're about to embark on is some people say it's like taking drug money, but we're about to involve ourselves with fact checkers, official Facebook as official fact checkers, because we think that getting into that space is pretty important, and we get access to the bucket of claims that people want checked, and so also it gives us a source of income, because as you know, our ABC and RMIT have no money to expand, so we have to find through donations and through maybe this fee for service arrangement an income flow. And as there are no sort of editorial guidelines or parameters imposed by Facebook on us, we feel it's and we're totally independent in our operations. We thought this was a good space to get into if we can. And also, you know, although we're still looking very much at open sites on Facebook and not the closed ones, we still get a sense of the trends and what's happening and the way information is being pushed around by being part of that partnership. But I think that the big challenge for us, and maybe we can bring all these things together, is how we do this federal election differently. You know, we're thinking of setting up, not thinking, but we're exploring the idea of creating tip lines. Maybe if we get into the Facebook arrangement, looking at the sort of data that's flowing around there and feeding it in, and then setting up a team where we can effectively debunk information through the election campaign, as well as maintaining our traditional fact checking of what the politicians are saying out on the stump. That's probably all I want to say at this stage. But you know, we're very new to this research space, and it's great to be here and to hear the sort of work that everybody's been doing, because that all absolutely feeds into our knowledge of this ecosystem in which we're trying to explore. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Russell. I might come back to you quickly, and then move on to the questions on Slido to give people time to think about your talk and respond to it. Russell, given the theme around sort of borderline content, I suppose in the sort of fact-checking misinformation space, when you're involved in these kinds of activities in social media, I guess how do you deal with the challenge of perhaps not wanting to buy into or amplify conspiracy theories? How do you decide what to take on and what not to take on, I suppose, is the question.
Okay. Well, we meet together as a team and we discuss, you know, what content we're going to, and a lot of this content's already appearing in our Corona Check newsletter. We're making these decisions, but we will not go after anything which is not being shared widely. That's a first, absolute first. You know, if it's been widely shared, we feel we've got to get into that space and debunk it as quickly as we can. And I suppose, you know, when it comes to, say, the Batuta Advocate and things like that are pushing out, you know, something which is semi-humorous, which has been taken up as serious, you know, we use our own editorial judgment to make a call on, no, we're not going to check that, you know. I think what's sort of important is the significance of what's being said. I mean, some things that we debunk are just blatant, you know, fake news. Like, it'll be a press release in the name of the Minister for Health saying that people don't need to get vaccinated anymore, or that he's withdrawn a particular vaccine, which is very, it's a very simple exercise to push that out and just to debunk it. There are grey areas. I guess we sort of discuss it. We're all very experienced journalists, and we don't want to amplify or make the situation worse by going after stuff which might seem extreme and ridiculous, but which nobody's actually looking at, because we feel we'll just draw attention to it. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much for that. All right, let's have a look what we've got here. There's a question that I think is for Tim from an account called Anus Fungi. The question appears
Put the level of this amazing panel with these amazing speakers down to that level. I'm so sorry.
Can you guess what the question is?
I don't even want to. Yeah.
The question is just 2 mushroom emoji.
Well, that's an easy one.
I'll go chronologically. Robyn, question from Brooke. Do you get the sense that there's a public appetite to close these moderation loopholes? And if so, is any work being done on that front?
No, I'd actually say the opposite. I'd actually say there's been kind of a bigger push, particularly around like certain issues of kind of public safety or public health to expand this. And I mean, it really goes either way. You have, and I think that a lot of these debates, you have kind of equal voices on both sides of it. But yeah, you see many calls to kind of expand platforms' use of like editorial judgment and how they're prioritizing different users and how they're treating their content. And a lot of those demands end up getting focused around how they should be prioritizing or highlighting official sources. So we have seen that with COVID a lot. And we saw that in the US with the US Census and with the election. And there's lots of different cases with this. I think one of the main concerns that I am seeing is that platforms can't really be trusted to make these sorts of distinctions, and that they're often doing that, making these in ways that benefit them financially. And that is what our research has shown. I think I'd probably fall into that camp of just being highly skeptical of platforms and their capacity to make these distinctions all the time. But yeah, you're seeing calls on both sides.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions which I'll kind of smush together for both Ari and for Robyn about geographical and cultural differences. So apologies, I can't remember who asked which. For Robyn, I guess the question is around, as well as differences between elite or insider actors within the US, where YouTube is based. What about internationally? What kind of disparities do we see there? And then for Ari, how do we deal with the situatedness, cultural specificity of what constitutes harmful humour? So what might the research strategy be to understand how geographical, cultural differences for different groups plays out? So I don't know. Do you want to go first?
Well, that's the 1 million question. Like, it's really difficult to account for the contextual specificity of humorous expression, but also hate speech. And so I think that, well, there are different issues here. So the leaked document that the Wall Street Journal published, they said, okay, you see how US companies prioritize content moderation in the US. This is something that we know, and we know that the lobbyists like advocacy groups and civil society that are lobbying these companies, most of the changes that they do, if they improve their policies, the result benefits how, like, for instance, hate speech plays out in the US. We saw how they failed completely, Facebook in Myanmar and in other regions in the world where like conflict is going on, and you have really like material impacts of what's happening in these networks, then this materializes, for instance, in violence. But the thing is that for me, if these platforms are benefiting from these emerging markets and they are global and they have a power because they are really just getting advertising money from like operating globally, they have to be more mindful into how, like, where they are operating, really knowing more and just having representatives there and working with civil society and advocacy groups in these places to really tackle the issues. And sometimes it's, you can start with controversies when things that you know that there are crises, you can be more responsive to this crisis. And I'm sure that we have, every time that they implement a new policy, we have NGOs writing policy and responses to it. So it's just listening more to what they have to say and then acting accordingly. Because as Robyn has said, there's no interest in the end to really like improve this globally. They just want to, it's a PR exercise most of the time to really say, okay, after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, they made a change in their hate speech policies to ban blackface and to ban racial stereotypes that are really linked to US culture. And if you talk to representatives inside Facebook, they will say, yeah, we have, like in our plans, we will consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia to see how these racial stereotypes play out here, to like extend our list of racial stereotypes. That could be one step, but we haven't seen much about this. And I think that it comes down to really that maybe there's not the political will to be responsive to this contextual specificity.
Yeah, maybe when the Wall Street Journal does a big expose of racism against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Facebook, then we'll see action. Yeah. Robyn, do you want to comment on the geographical or international dimensions of what you're talking about?
Yes, so I agree with everything that was just said. The report I did on content or context moderation 3 years ago found something very similar. It found that platforms have, it's now again, another industry standard that we're seeing across platforms is this emergent engagement with external stakeholder groups. And how that engagement happens is heavily biased globally and often kind of takes shape, at least initially for most of the major platforms, out of a who they know kind of like informal relationships that then start building up. I actually just finished my dissertation work on this topic as well, and I don't think it'll ever be published because this chapter was written pre and post the toddler that is screaming outside this door. So it needs a lot of edit. But in that work, what I look at is this kind of general orientation towards networked platform governance that we are seeing at these companies, an emergent standard of engaging with external stakeholder groups in a way that kind of fulfills a PR mission. Many of those engagements end up being incredibly unequal and are based entirely on where the platforms themselves have offices, who they are connected with on the ground, where their representatives are located, and can introduce new forms of opacity into platform content policymaking over time. So not just in terms of inequities of who gets to speak to platforms, but also because when these platforms are engaging with all of these different groups, they're often not telling everybody who else they're engaging with. And so you have no idea as an external stakeholder group who your kind of feedback and expertise is being weighed against. So yes, there's a considerable amount of inequality in terms of how this engagement is taking shape.
Okay, I have 2 questions for Russell and 2 for Tim and 1 for the whole panel, which may see us out, I think. So Russell, first from Brooke Coco. how do fact checkers maintain a public reputation for trustworthiness, especially when addressing controversial content, perhaps wading into this whole social media space? And the other one is, I've lost it, but it was about the development of sort of fact-checking mechanisms and tools by the major platforms. What relationship, what what might be the opportunities for outlets to use those tools or develop their own tools in addition to the sort of work you're doing?
With the issue of trust, I think you just got to be accurate. If you're wrong, they jump all over you, and we have at the ABC an incredibly comprehensive complaint system, which people are very quick to use. And I think it's sort of interesting in this deeply polarized space in which we operate. You know, we'll put something out and we'll get a pile on from the left or the right, depending on who we've checked. This is in traditional fact checking. And sort of, we went through a stage where we were funded by the ABC. The ABC lost funding, and that's why we ended up with RMIT ABC Fact Check. But when the ABC said they were going to discontinue with fact checking because they had no money, a whole lot of people in the middle came out, people we hadn't heard of, people who didn't follow us necessarily, and came to our support. So I think what we're trying to do is inform people. We're not going to motive. We're not saying this person, this politician is saying bad things because he made a particular claim. We just look at the claim and we put out all of our data, we put out all of our sources, we're totally transparent, there's no confidential sources involved, and people can make up their own mind, and they're perfectly free to disagree. Our purpose is to inform, not to persuade, if you like, in terms of traditional fact checking. And I think we've never had to correct a verdict in almost 9 years of fact checking through the complaint system at the ABC. So, you know, we have nuanced verdicts. So we try and get as close to the facts as we possibly can, or the data that we've produced. I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The second one was about the more recent development of all kinds of fact-checking tools by the major platforms or independently, and outlets engaging in their own. I suppose it's about verification within news making, perhaps.
Well, we're exploring the tools that are available, and there are a few, but the main one, which I think all fact checkers have been dependent on, is CrowdTangle. And I think CrowdTangle obviously has huge limitations into what it can actually tell us and what it can deliver in terms of our fact checking. At the moment, we're having some confidential discussions with a couple of developers about different tools which we might adopt for this federal election as we go forward. At the moment, it's sort of manual, and from our point of view, what comes to our notice, what people send us, which is, you know, totally inadequate in a sense when you think of the thousands, millions of bits of misinformation that's floating around the system. So I think the challenge for us as RMIT Fact Lab is to actually get some decent tools in place. And if you look at sort of Full Fact in the UK, they had a huge manual team of people doing stuff in the last UK election. It was quite effective, but they hired heaps of people. We can't afford to do that, so we need the tools.
Great, thank you. Could we have the aircon button pressed? Tim? No. From Ashwin. Tim, is the visibility and logic of upvoting and downvoting on the Reddit platform, does that perhaps make it easy to gamify and perhaps lead to some of the behaviour that you're talking about? And then from PJ, Tim, you talk about the fuzzy line between bot identity and human identity in online environments. Do you see a future in which bots become public figures?
What a great question. Okay, well, I'll start with the first. I think it's funny that I think the upvote, downvote mechanism on Reddit is, to some extent, Reddit, which is to say that what passes for discourse on Reddit, how culture plays out on Reddit, is, in a sense, inseparable. You can't really make sense of it outside like that functionality. And funnily enough, a shout out to Alicia Rodriguez. I'm not sure if she's watching, but we actually had a paper just published, and I haven't had a chance to respond to the email, that actually makes that argument. So thank you for a question that actually speaks to something that I know about and can offer something for. But I think to your question, yes, I do think that the particular rating and ranking system on Reddit shapes fundamentally. Sorry, what was the
Well, what's the relationship, I suppose, between that mechanism of economics of attention and like the existence of such a bot? Or
so it can be gamed, and it is a major part. So if you look at like Reddit's rules and you look at terms of service and things, platform manipulation really centers around like the upvote and downvote button. And things like brigading, so there's like years and years of scholarship that looks at the way that like groups of people, even when they're very small but very large, can enroll this kind of functionality into their mobilization, into their collective action for harm and for good as well. So I think that one cannot really make sense of bots or gamification or the political economy or the culture of Reddit without also taking into account the way that the vote button kind of shapes that. Reddit is the front page of the internet in its own terms, although it has changed that recently. I think because of this fundamental imbrication of the upvote, downvote button, for which it is now amassed fortunes. This was its business model. It's the lifeblood of Reddit. So everything that passes on Reddit must pass through that socio-technical kind of arrangement that they have. I'm not sure if that answers the question. Yeah. And PJ's question, man, I'm still waking up. So this is this keys towards it's a very fundamental question. I think when it comes, like much of the science fiction and the popular imagination around social bots has centered upon not social bots, but bots in general, has centered upon not what do bots do and what do machines do and what do AI do, but what does it mean to be human? And with that question, how can we differentiate ourselves from bots? So films like Blade Runner that I kind of asked a question about. I want to pick up on. Thanks, Gene. I want to pick up on a point that Axel made yesterday, and I think that hopefully this does some service to answer your question, PJ. I think that hybridity is really the concept for the horizon of social bot studies. And when it comes to questions about identity and selfhood and political action and political communication, I really think that it makes very little sense to try and purify this binary distinction between what is a bot and what is a human. I really think that you fail to operationalize that concept when you apply it analytically to study any kind of communication or sociality on platforms. So I think hybridity is where it's at. And to finish, the question about whether a bot may become a public figure, I think to some extent that already is the case. And I pick up on the work that Ariadna had mentioned before, and Louisa's work as well. I think that the professionalization of influence on social media is the professionalization to some extent of different techniques that enable you to get through that curve, to not be in the 99%, the long tail that no one pays attention to. Automation is one way to do that. And so, this work is picking up on that. And I think it shows that if you make it as a YouTuber, okay, you might just think, oh, okay, this YouTuber, I don't know, I'll just pick a silly example like PewDiePie or something like that. I don't know. Yeah, I'm so sorry. But perhaps that's not a good example. But I mean, talk to Louisa and Ariadna about the particularities of that work and these kinds of accounts. But I think you look at them and you think they're successful, they made it. But one needs to peer into the black box, I think, of how they utilized automation, or at least they set up kind of low effort kind of automated practices like an Excel spreadsheet that they just copy and paste these links out of hundreds of times per hour like a robot because they want to make it so bad. And so I think the answer to the question, PJ, is perhaps you've got a kind of like cyborgs you know, who may be public figures in the future. And I think that is, to me, that's what Blade Runner became, actually, films like that. I think that's what we ended up with. So that I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Can I make there are legal scholars that are theorizing protecting bot expression under the First Amendment. So like in the legal space, there's things going on also in this regard. Yeah.
I was just going to add that half awake Tim is so awesome. Like you should come to work half awake all the time, half asleep. Yeah. The final one for whoever on the panel wants to address it is how committed do you think the major platforms are to having people with diverse lived experiences who may be affected by some of the things that we're talking about on their content moderation teams? Whoever wants to take that one.
Very briefly, I think that there are people inside these companies really interested in bringing this perspective into play, but they are quite hierarchical, these companies too, so all their efforts get lost if the final say is just the CEO of these big companies. So yeah, I think it's really difficult to get these platforms to change when, yeah, like the change probably will not mean like commercial interest for them. So giving up like power and privilege to accommodate and to be more fair, I don't think that this will happen unless, yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but sometimes coming from a European background, I think that like regulation is important. So yeah, like good regulation that really like is sensitive to these perspectives, to historically marginalized groups and people that are the target of online abuse. In this case, it's quite important to really make these places safe for everyone. Or places where everyone can express, like Zara's work, you know, that we don't think that sexual content is harmful, but really like allow expression and joy, as you say also, Jean. So yeah, it's a complex.
Yes.
Long answer, sorry.
Well, I suppose the question is what you can do, you know, what the trade-offs are or what you can achieve politically but through diversity within the workforce working on these things, and what you achieve through external exogenous drivers like regulation and so on. Robyn, last word from you.
I had to feel like I was going to get called on, so I unmuted. This is a really complicated question that I don't think we have enough information about to answer properly. I think that we've seen, so absolutely, these platforms are incredibly hierarchical, and a lot of the missteps that we've seen in the past actually emerge from this kind of at once distributed, almost too distributed, never quite bureaucratizing nature of some of these companies like Facebook. That are simultaneously existing in like an extreme hierarchy where the founder has like a lot of control over kind of final decisions. And we've seen a lot of missteps that come out of, you know, what happens when you create a platform that is from the perspective of like very privileged white male users in America. That has led to a lot of problems. I don't know if there are a lot of diversity statistics that are being captured by the trust and safety community. It would be really interesting to ask the Trust and Safety Professional Association. That's a new association that is emerging for people within the trust and safety world, includes policy, people who are making policy and people who are enforcing policy. And it would be really interesting to see them do a big survey of all of the people at all of the major companies. I can't really speculate as to what is going on there. One of the big concerns I have, though, is that we are not moving towards more diversity of this workforce. We are moving more towards automation. So that is, if the direction we were headed in was, you know, we are seeing, yes, Facebook is adding on like more moderators, not enough. And YouTube has added on more moderators and not enough. But largely the move that we are seeing is towards creating standardized rules that are very context, not specific, so that they can continue to at least flag content that might be moderated by humans.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We need to move to the next session, but please give everyone a hand. Thank you, Robyn and Russell.